Now we're going to look at Chapter 6. Now that we have a reasonable idea of how markets work, of how the interaction of buyers and sellers results in a price and quantity that's exchanged in a market, we're going to think about things from the firm's point of view, and we're going to ultimately see how costs are determinant of the firm's supply curve. We're going to start out thinking about the firm's production cost. We're going to make a distinction between explicit and implicit costs and see how that leads to a discussion of distinction between economic profits and accounting profits. We'll define those and see what the big difference is. We're going to talk about the law of diminishing returns, returns to an input in the production process, and take a look at the short-run cost curves and be able to identify them and see how they regularly look graphically. By the way, there are going to be 2 presentations from Chapter 6 because we have so much to do from this chapter. So when we think about the costs that a firm face, we can separate those into 2 distinct kinds. Remember, we talked about the opportunity cost of a resource. We talked about the opportunity cost of your time. If you remember, we mentioned something like, well, because the NBA was willing to pay LeBron James $20 million, then a decision to go to college would mean that he had to forego that $20 million, and so that decision would be somewhat costly. That runs in the same vein as these explicit and implicit costs that we're going to distinguish between when we talk about the costs that a firm faces. Explicit costs are going to be costs that are paid out of pocket. These are things like money that must be paid for a production facility, money that would have to be paid in wages to workers, or money that would have to be paid for other inputs that are used in the production process. You pay your rent, you pay your utility bill, and those sort of things that are paid out of pocket. And there are implicit costs. These are costs that are not paid out explicitly, like paying the rent, but these are nonetheless costs that are incurred and more like opportunity costs, right? Things that we have to give up when we choose to use a resource for one purpose instead of another purpose. And so these are the opportunity costs of the resources used in production, and we'll tell a little story about that in just a second. We'll see how implicit cost can change and can be vital to the decision-making process. When we define a profit in accounting terms, we're looking at the total revenue, that is, the money that the firm brings in minus the total explicit cost, the money that the firm pays out. So revenue looks something like price times quantity, so that if we sell 100 units for $5 each, our revenue would be $500. And we would subtract off from that $500 anything that we had to pay for inputs in our production process, and if that explicit cost, things that we had to pay out, was, say, $400, and we had to have $100 left over in that period as profits. These are accounting profits. And so the difference between an accounting profit and an economic profit is that the economic profit takes that total revenue, subtracts off all the explicit costs that are paid out for resources used in the production process, but also accounts for any implicit costs. So what we want to think about is how including implicit costs and thinking about an economic profit can lead us to a different decision than just thinking about the accounting profit from the firm's point of view. So let's imagine that there are 2 guys. Imagine that the guys are hanging out in some bar and grill, and they say, man, it would be great to quit my job and open my own place, have a little restaurant with a bar or something. And so we can imagine that the 2 guys each go to different sides of town and open their own little bar and grill restaurant. Now, this decision is not so popular when each of them gets home and tells their wife and says, wife, I decided to quit my job and open a bar and grill down on the east side of town, or something like that. The wife says, are you crazy? You probably shouldn't have quit your job. And he says, well, I'll be able to get my job back. Just give me a year, and if at the end of the year, if I've earned a profit, then I'll stay in the bar and grill. And if I haven't earned a profit, then I'll go back to my old job. So the difference between these two entrepreneurs in this case is that one of them is a partner in a law firm, currently earns something like $200,000 per year. And one of them is a sales representative that earns something like $50,000 a year. They each go to their own side of town and open their bar and grill restaurant. And at the end of 1 year, each of them has an accounting profit of $100,000. So they both did well. So they each go back to their wives, and the salesperson goes back to his wife and says, guess what? I earned a profit of $100,000 in my restaurant. So I don't have to go back to being a salesperson. And this family is happy, right? They earned an accounting profit of $100,000, and so the $50,000 that he gave up, including the explicit cost, or if we subtract off the implicit cost there from the accounting profit of $100,000, then the salesperson has earned in his restaurant endeavor an economic profit of $50,000. That is, he earned $50,000 more in the restaurant than he did in his job as a salesperson. His economic profit is over and above what his next best use of his time was. On the other hand, the partner in the law firm, who also made an accounting profit of $100,000, decides to get out of the restaurant business. Why is that? Well, at the end of the year, all his revenues minus his explicit costs, which we called accounting profit, was $100,000. But the salary that he had to give up to go into the restaurant business was $200,000, which means that if we subtract off his implicit cost, the salary that he had to give up when he left the law firm, his economic profit was negative $100,000. So the same accounting profit of $100,000, the former partner in the law firm ended up with a negative economic profit because he had a much higher opportunity cost or implicit cost of the restaurant endeavor. So that the salesperson ends up $50,000 better off and stays in the restaurant business, and the partner in the law firm ends up closing his restaurant and going back to the law firm, even though the two people made the same exact accounting profit. Because of their implicit cost, they reached different decisions about their business endeavors. So think about that, and think about how these implicit costs that you face affect your decisions in your own life. The Chapter 6 will conclude in the next presentation.